So much fun last week in the first hour on Coast to Coast talking to a rock and roll legend. We decided to do it again. I'll tell you about that coming up in just a second on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. An hour from now, we will begin to crack archaeology's greatest mystery, that which existed before the pyramids. Christopher Knight will be our guest. You may know him as the co-author of the very popular book, The Hiram Key, which is a controversial history of Freemasonry. We'll talk a little bit about that, too. And about how in just earlier this week, you may have heard reported that there's a new henge found within a stone's throw of Britain's Stonehenge. And that's not surprising. The idea of many henges and their role in our human history, in Western history, in religious history, actually, won't be surprising when we talk with Christopher Knight. But they do have henges, and the way they are shaped in the landscape has a big part here in our understanding of the pyramids. So we'll be tying in the henges and the pyramids coming up about an hour from now on Coast to Coast, and we'll be talking about this latest discovery of this new henge. It would be, not so surprising to people who've been researching just how these henges were laid out and what they represented to the people on Earth, much like in the same way the pyramids were. And we'll talk about all of that, how they tie in, the pyramids and the henges, on the way next hour on Coast to Coast. This hour, as I mentioned, another music legend. This guy had a very interesting secret history going on, all the while that Tommy James of Tommy James and the Shondells was having, huge hit records. Crystal Blue Persuasion, Crimson and Clover, Moni Modi, going all the way back to Hanky Panky. All the while that was going on, he was working for the mob. The record company, Roulette Records, was mob-owned. And when I say that, you might think, well, they could be mob-controlled. No. They were mob-owned. And Tommy James will explain how it was that he actually never got any royalties for his music while he was working for Roulette, and how it was that you kind of came to accept that deal when you saw the kind of bruisers and thugs that were sitting in the waiting room of Roulette Records, who were walking around the hallways. All of the big mafia families that you would have been hearing about in the news at the time were walking around in and out of meetings over at Roulette Records. They were his bosses, and he knew it. And we'll talk about that. The book is called Me, the Mob, and the Music. It was a hell of a ride for Tommy James. It's a really fun story with some fairly dark turns that you would never expect if you're a music fan. Also, he'll talk here just a second about a story I'll have to ask him about, because it happened to him too. The story out of Germany today, crowds of people going to a techno musical fest went into kind of panic mode, and they started pushing against each other, and 18 people died. Almost 100 people were injured at this event, which was intended to celebrate love and peace. And the same thing happened once with Tommy James and the Shondells. We'll tell you about the lives lost then, too, next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. Me, the Mob, and the Music, One Hell of a Ride with Tommy James and the Shondells is the book written by Tommy James with a little help from Martin Fitzpatrick, but pretty much tells the story in first-person narrative from beginning to end, how it all got started, and, in a lot of ways, how it's not over yet. Hey, Tommy James.
How are you?
Oh, I'm so geeked. I'm having a geek moment. I think it's really cool to talk to you. And I, like everybody else, we all have our favorite Tommy James and the Shondells tunes, and I want to talk a little bit about the music, but it's more the Mob and you part that intrigues us, because that really is a secret part of your history. I don't think it's been fully told until now.
No, you're quite right. Actually, when we first signed with Roulette, we had no inclination this was going on. We learned it incrementally, actually. And if I can give you just a brief overview of how we ended up on Roulette, I had recorded Hanky Panky 2 years, in my junior year in high school back in my hometown of Niles, Michigan. The record came out and really... it was great in about 6 square blocks, but that was about it.
Right.
It was released on a little label called Snap Records. And the record, came and went pretty fast. We couldn't get any distribution because we were right in the middle between Detroit and Chicago. So we were kind of in a dead zone, and the record just ended. So the following year, 1965, I took my band on the road, and we played up through Rush Street in Chicago and up into Wisconsin, and in March of 1966, we're playing a little club in Janesville, Wisconsin, and right in the middle of our 2 weeks, the guy gets shut down by the IRS for not paying his taxes. So we very sheepishly grab our equipment and go back home feeling very defeated and very depressed. But that's how the good Lord works, because as soon as I got back to Niles, I got the call that Hanky Panky, this record that we had recorded 2 years earlier, had been bootlegged in Pittsburgh and was sitting at number one. They sold 80,000 copies.
Let's just look at that as a model. You learned within your first couple of years in the business how fluky the record business could be.
Oh, for sure.
You learned the role of the IRS in the music business right away, which would come in handy later on.
Yes, indeed.
And then you learned too that you got a lot. There's a lot of bootlegging going on of music back then that probably doesn't happen to the same degree now. But let's put that on hold for the moment. And let me just say, let me fast forward you a little bit because of this news story about a concert crush, which is not unlike what you witnessed after Tommy James and the Shondells became national sensations. You were playing, I think, was it in Phoenix?
It was in Phoenix, a place called Encanto Park with a big band shell. And we were brought in by local radio, and we're doing a concert at the band shell, and the place was just really loaded with people, and I mean there was probably 40,000-50,000 people all told there, and we were brought on stage. We came out of a Brinks armored truck, and ended up on stage, and right in the middle of, I think we're alone now, there was this rush to the stage, and we looked down, and 2 girls were crushed to death down. And right in front of us, and it was pretty horrible. And we felt really, really bad about the whole thing for so long.
And here you have this music festival in Germany. 18.
Yeah, I saw that.
Isn't that? And I know that slightly different circumstances, but still 18 crushed to death. Just
isn't that something?
To come and hear music, and
I know it's just. I guess it happens, but boy, I'll tell you something. It's just when that happens right in front of you, and of course we felt responsible for what happened.
Right. understand that. Well, it goes to show you in rock and roll, in music history, a lot of things, of this history kind of repeats itself. And I thought this was an interesting reflection that you offered in the book. Again, we're talking with Tommy James, me, the mob, and the music. Is that you and like a lot of other bands, you were measuring your success on the basis of how many people were screaming.
Yeah, that's
right?
True. That's true. Well, that's the way it was, particularly at our first concerts that were, the big shows. The first 3 months of our career really, were a building process. But once we were there, it was quite literally how much excitement you created, how much energy was in the place, and how many screams there were. That's very true.
And but I couldn't help but think about that as I was reading your book. Really, by the way, very enjoyable book. Great story.
Thank you. I'm really happy you liked it.
Oh, you should, and you should be happy that you wrote it. It's really cool. So, and we'll be just touching on things that are explained in much greater detail in the book. So,
sure.
Fans ought to get it. Here's the part that really is the dark side of the whole screaming panic thing, because there's like a tipping point. And so when you have a crowd, when you got tens of thousands of screaming people who are all screaming your name and coming at you, that's like really flattering until that tipping point.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
That would get very scary to be up there on stage when things start.
We had some pretty scary moments, I must say. All I can say is that was the time. That was at that moment in our history. Rock and roll was really meant for a certain age group that got very excited, and that's just the way it was.
Right. So as I put you on hold earlier on that topic of the career arc, but it is fascinating the way that Hanky Panky gets You're a junior in high school and you record it, but you don't. A couple years later, suddenly you find you have the #1 record in Pittsburgh. Out of the blue, a disc jockey tracks you down. You find out you don't even believe it at first, right? When they're calling to say,
I thought it was somebody playing a joke. When I got the call that explained what had happened in Pittsburgh, it was just such a miracle. I couldn't believe it. And when I went to Pittsburgh, quite literally outside the city limits, I was nobody. As soon as we crossed the city limits through the Liberty Tunnel, went into Pittsburgh, suddenly I'm a rock star, quite literally from
Right.
one night to another.
Right.
So when we got there, we did local TV and so forth, and local television, and Hanky Panky indeed was #1, and I sort of grabbed the first bar band I could find to be the Shondells, because I couldn't put the original group back together.
Yeah, I mean that's the part of it too that's so funny is you were Tommy James and the Shondells without the Shondells.
With no Shondells.
You guys were all in high school when you did that, or at least many of the people in the band were of that age, and they were all going on to do their other things in life. And so you got to find some local guys to go, okay, on break, you're the Shondells, and
right.
suddenly go out on stage and be the Shondells. It's very funny.
That's true enough. And of course, the record broke out of the one market, and they sold 80,000 of them in like 10 days. So indeed, it was bootleg too, by the way. The Hanky Band was bootleg. So I grabbed this. I found this group called the Raconteurs that were really great, and they became the Shondells. And a week later, we're all in New York selling the master.
Right.
A fellow by the name of Bob Mack who was the local DJ who played our record first, became our first manager, and we were all in New York a week later to shop the master. And
you end up working for the mob. I mean, I think that I'm just trying to shorthand that seems inconceivable. And yet there's been a lot of mob participation, a lot of mafia work that has been involved in the record industry from the very beginning. Mostly, I think people in the know think of mob involvement with rock and roll as being related to jukeboxes, that the mob controlled the jukeboxes.
Yeah. Well, when we got to New York, basically, we were so thrilled because we got a yes from all the record companies, Columbia, Epic, RCA, Atlantic, remember Kamasutra Records?
Sure.
And the last place they took the record to, I didn't even go. The last place they took the record to was Roulette Records. And it was sort of an afterthought. And so I'm going to bed that night feeling really good. And the next morning, one by one, the phone starts ringing, and one by one, all the record companies called that had said yes the day before and said, listen, Tom, we got to pass.
Yeah.
And I said, what do you mean you got to pass? Finally, Jerry Wexler at Atlantic leveled with us and told us that Morris Levy from Roulette Records had called all the record companies individually and scared him, and he basically said, this is my record.
Right.
And that's how he talked, and that's just how it was. And he backed them all down, and we were apparently going to be on Roulette Records.
Which is, it's fair to say that you weren't working for a mob-controlled label. You were working for a mob-owned label.
That's quite true. It looked okay at first, and then incrementally we began learning what Roulette was. And indeed, Roulette Records was financed and run by the Genovese crime family in New York, and Morris Levy, who was the head of the label, was every bit as much a gangster as the rest of them. And so we're quite literally, seeing people that we later would see on television. We'd meet somebody in Morris's office, and a week later we'd see him being taken out of a warehouse in New Jersey in handcuffs.
Right. Right. Or on a stretcher. Or
true enough. That's right.
Right.
That's quite right.
And so here, and especially even on your very first day, if I remember correctly, that's when you heard them openly talking about what they were as a label, how they were going to handle people that were bootlegging your bootleg. The very thing that you had bootlegged on you in Pittsburgh, as soon as Roulette Records got involved, they had a very different way of handling bootleggers.
Well, that's true. I was up meeting Morris Levy, the head of the label, who, by the way, was fascinating. You couldn't take your eyes off this guy. He was right out of Central Casting. He was about 6'3", 4". He's about 250 and talked like this. And I met him, and I met a whole bunch of other people that were really fascinating in Morris's office, including a couple of the labels that we'd been to the previous day. I couldn't figure that one out. So all of a sudden, in the middle of our meeting, these two thugs walk up to the door. Two bruisers walk up to Morris's door and say, "Mice, can we see you?" And so Morris says, "Excuse me," and he gets up and he goes and talks to him, and they're, as you say, openly talking about beating some guys, breaking some guy's legs out in Jersey for pirating records, and that's where they had just been. And Morris says something like, "You do what you got to do," and it's loud enough for us to hear all this. And Red Schwartz, the head of promotion, turns to me, trying to small talk. He says, "So, is this your first trip to New York, Tom?"
That's great. That's great.
So bells and whistles should have gone off right there.
But you were who were you? I mean, in the sense that they had all the power, and as I have been telling people all week long, who would have thought that with all of the success of Tommy James and the Shondells, that you weren't getting paid royalties because, well, you just knew not to complain about not getting royalties.
Well, that's very true, but I also, this book is essentially an autobiography with about 2/3 of it devoted to explaining this very complicated relationship. And this very dark and sinister story. And of course, it's about us trying to have a career in the music business with this very dangerous story going on behind us.
Yeah.
And so essentially, as we would meet people up there, we'd meet people that we knew from television, very notorious people. And we're seeing them floating around up there. Roulette was used essentially as everything from a social club where these guys hung out to illegal bank accounts and everything else. And so we're walking on eggshells trying to stay out of people's way up there.
It was kind of a money laundering operation in a way.
It definitely was. They were a legitimate record company
sure.
too. And but we had to basically get our arms around the fact that we were not going to get mechanical royalties.
No.
And that's just the way it was going to be. And the question was, did we want to upset the apple cart and really take our lives in our hands by complaining too much, or did we want to take the success we were having and parlay it in other ways?
Well, it was, if you'll pardon me for saying this, kind of your classic deal with the devil.
It was indeed. That's very right. Very true.
You took the success and the fame, but you gave a pound of flesh in order to get it. And we'll talk more about that coming up next with Tommy James. Me, the mob, and the music. I want to ask Tommy James to do a quick computation in his head, or at least what he thinks he might have lost in terms of the money that was tithed to the mob, the money that the royalties that should have come to him and to the other writers who never got a penny from Roulette Records and knew not to press them on that issue because they were the mafia. More about me, the mob, and the music coming up next, and we'll get into a couple of your calls for Tommy James next, too. On Coast to Coast, this is Ian Punnett.
Sign up now for Coast Zone, our free email newsletter. Get it today at coasttocoastam.com. With Ian Punnett. Call the wildcard line at 818-501-4109. The first-time caller line is 818-501-4721. To talk toll-free from east of the Rockies, call 800-825-5033. West of the Rockies, toll-free at 800-618-8255. International callers may reach Ian by calling their in-country Sprint access number, pressing option 5, and dialing toll-free 1-800-893-0903. This is Coast to Coast AM with Ian Punnett.
Well, Tommy James has gotten a new book out, Me, the Mob, and the Music. It talks about his connection with Roulette Records, the relationship he had over the years with a mob-owned record label. What that was like to work for the mob, to make hit records for the mob. He was a hitman for the mob. You could say that. Tommy James was a hitman for the mob. But the devil is in the details there, and we'll get to that coming in just a minute. Also, coming up next hour, Before the Pyramids, cracking archaeology's greatest mystery. They have discovered a new henge outside of Stonehenge. It's a henge of henges there, actually, and that corresponds perfectly with the theories of Christopher Knight. We'll talk about the relationship between the henges and the pyramids coming up next hour. Your questions and calls with Tommy James. We'll get to a few of them before the top of the hour, but we'll tell you the rest of the story of what it was like to work for a mobster in the music business next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett. can't promise many of them, but we'll get to some calls before the top of the hour on Coast to Coast with Tommy James. Me, the Mob, and the Music is the book out that tells the story of what it was like to work for Roulette Records. I asked before the bottom of the hour, how much money do you think you had earned legally, rightfully, in royalties for your music that you never received while you were working for Roulette?
Well, our accountant told us that, before we were finished, before I actually left the label in the 70s, that with the amount of records we had sold worldwide, we did about 110 million records on Roulette. We had 23 gold singles, 9 gold and platinum albums, and it was estimated that the missing royalties were somewhere between $30 and $40 million. That's a lot of money even for back then.
Yeah.
And
that's a lot of money for a successful group now.
Yes.
I mean, and that was back then. So you worked that for inflation on what you were bringing.
Well, that's true. That's quite true. And but all through it, we were, of course, making money on the road. We were making money from the commercials and making money from our songwriting and BMI and so forth. But mechanical royalties just were not going to be paid, and that was a fact of life.
And that means the performance royalties from the label for what you were selling from the actual units that were being sold.
That's right. That's right.
All right.
And so I had to constantly, I had to make a decision. We all did very consciously have to make a decision about, do we put up with this? Do we try to change it? We all knew that what had happened to Jimmy Rogers, who went after his royalties from, he was a big artist with him during the 50s and early 60s, and went after his royalties and made a lot of noise about it and was left for dead on an LA freeway. And it was just by the grace of God that he survived, and because he was in good shape. And but he was never really right after that. And the point was that we were very aware that bad stuff could happen to us, and there were some very frightening moments up there, frankly, with as this progressed. We were very lucky to make it out of there in one piece, I had always felt. Plus the fact that, every time I go to say something really, really nasty about Morris Levy and Roulette Records, I always have to temper everything I say with the fact that if it wasn't for Roulette and Morris Levy, there wouldn't have been a Tommy James.
Well, and you say that because he gave you a lot of autonomy, that the trade-off in this deal with the devil was unlike a lot of other record labels. You would have had a lot more of a corporatocracy involved in your music.
That's right. If we had gone with one of the more corporate labels, Columbia, RCA, we would have probably, especially with a record like Hanky Panky, we would have been handed to a producer, lost in the numbers, and that's probably the last time anybody would have ever heard from us. At Roulette, they genuinely needed us. They were a working record company, after all, and they hadn't had a hit in about 3 years. So they left us alone in the studio and allowed us to morph into whatever we could become. And I got an education at Roulette that I could have never gotten anywhere else, and I know that we would have never had the number of hits that we had, and or gotten to tell this story. So.
Right. Well, and we're only telling part of the story because the names of the crime families involved that were regularly in the office at Roulette. I mean, you met some of the best-known mobsters of the 1960s and 70s. At least you met them before they were whacked.
Well, true enough, and it was essentially the Genovese family that was running Roulette Records. I go into some detail about names. I must tell you, though, I was very uncomfortable and very concerned when we started this out. We started this book out about 7 years ago, Martin and I, and essentially we were going to write a book about the hits and about the music. We were going to call it Crimson and Clover, and it would have been a very interesting music book. But we got about a third of the way into it and realized that if we don't tell the roulette story, the real story, we are going to be cheating everybody, including ourselves. But I was very uncomfortable because some of these guys were still walking around back then. And, so I really felt we need to put the book on a shelf for a couple of years before we finish it. And indeed, the last of what I call the roulette regulars died in early '06, and we felt that at that point we could finish the book, and we did. And immediately got a deal with Simon and Schuster, and by the way, the book is going to be a movie and a Broadway show.
Good. Well, the Broadway show part, that everybody's doing that with with hit makers like yourself, and I think that'll be interesting. I would very much like to see it as a movie that tells the story of this and this relationship you had with Morris Levy, and I think there's some. I hope they include the scene. And just to illustrate the point of how mob-controlled, mob-owned Roulette Records was, that tell the story about how the day that Morris Levy, your boss, the owner of the record label, supposedly, when he went out to deal with a bootlegger, I think it was on Long Island or New Jersey, but the one he had heard about that was out there pressing copies of albums, of records, and the guy who claimed, he goes, I need to do this because I'm trying to put I have a kid in the hospital, I need to make some money. Tell that story.
Right. Well, Morris quite literally had so many different faces. They went to, basically beat this guy's brains out, and when he told his story to Morris, Morris ended up paying for his son who was in the hospital.
Okay, well, let me flesh it out a little bit better. You go out, I mean, he finds out that this is going on. He grabs a baseball bat in the office. I mean, This isn't, he I got to go now, grabs a baseball bat, and they get in a car to go beat the, life out of this guy. And when they get there, the guy says, my kid's in the hospital. And he said, if you don't have a kid in the hospital, you'll be in the hospital. And they follow the guy to the hospital, and they find out, no, he really does have a kid in the hospital. And Morris Levy writes a check to cover his surgery.
That is so typical of Morris Levy.
Yeah.
And honestly, one of the things that I try to do in this book is to kind of humanize Morris Levy in a certain way, because I learned a lot up there. I owe my career to this guy, and there is, quite literally in the book, there are many moments where, I get some insights into what Morris was all about and where he was coming from. He was a fascinating individual. If you just look at what he did, I mean, he opened Birdland. He was the most famous jazz club in the world. He was Alan Freed's manager. He had several clubs around New York. He was, responsible. He came about a half an inch away from trademarking the term rock and roll. Can you imagine if every time we said the words rock and roll, we had to pay Morris?
Right.
But the guy was amazing in that way.
But typical to that, though, too, he was also amazing, your mob, boss at Roulette Records, in owning things he didn't create.
True enough.
Based on pure muscle
and on songs that he didn't write. He was famous for doing stuff like that. And he was a thief.
Yeah, he was a thief, and let's just say, very likely, a murderer.
Quite right.
So, I mean, that's what you're working for. I
know, and so that really is a mixed bag, and that's why there are so many mixed feelings in all this. And this thing was very therapeutic. I've been wanting to tell this story for a very long time.
Well, I think we're only touching the surface, but in the time that we have, I promised we allowed a couple of your fans to grab a phone and talk with you. The book is Me, the Mob, and the Music. Tommy James has written the story of the one hell of a ride of Tommy James and the Shondells, and I would love to get more time on that, but let me just grab what we have here.
Sure.
And go to Doug west of the Rockies on Coast to Coast for Tommy James. Go ahead, Doug.
Right.
You got to get that radio off. You got to live in the now, Doug. Doug, we're going to lose you. Doug, we lost you. Okay. Dan in Sacramento, I hope you get that radio off in the background. Go ahead, Dan.
Hello, Ian. This is my first time calling you, hearing from you, and then this is my first time talking to a celebrity here in Citrus Heights, California.
Hi, Dan.
Borders. Hi, Tommy. How you doing?
Nice to talk with you.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Yeah. Do you have any children or anything? I mean,
I do.
Oh.
I have one son. His name is Brian. He's grown up now. He's 45 years old.
Oh my goodness. And I was just kind of, I just want to say, it's almost like, when you mentioned that, it is really, I just have like a few, I'm sorry, I'm kind of nervous, forgive me.
You get one?
Okay.
Go ahead.
I just have like a 3-part question.
No, you got to give us your best part up front, because we got some other people that want to get on.
Okay, yeah. And then I'll give my answer up, because I know there's other people behind me in line. I know. Is Roulette Records still around? And
no, Roulette Records basically, Morris Levy was finally convicted and sent to prison in 1987. And as a result, he unloaded Roulette Records to EMI and Warner Brothers, and he unloaded the publishing company, Big 7 Music, to, it ended up being EMI Music. And before he died, he contracted cancer, and before he could serve a day in prison, he died of cancer in 1990. And the book sort of it's the two parentheses of the book. We open the story at Morris's death, and then flash back, and then work our way back up to where we originally were with his death. And so in 1990, it all ended. And so Roulette, before he died, I will say he purchased Strawberry's music chain, and which was a big retailer in the record business, and that was the last of the big companies that he owned. But he passed in 1990, and it all ended right there.
All right, I'm about. I have like 2 chapters left to go in the book. So just to tell me a little bit, without maybe even telling the whole story, but does he end up acknowledging in the end, hey, by the way, I ripped you off all those years? Does he ever you ever have like a man-to-man talk about that later on?
Well, let me tell you, we had talked about things like that earlier on, but Morris and I had a terrible blowout in a very scary parting of the ways. And we get into that. That happened in the 70s. And for all those years afterwards, when we were having hits with 3 Times in Love and so forth at Millennium and other labels that we were with, we basically didn't talk a lot. We talked once or twice. And then right at the end, we had the same accountant. And we would almost pass notes to each other like kids in school, because, Morris was pretty proud, and I didn't really want to talk to him. He offered me a label in 85, and I just couldn't do it. And that was right when we sort of buried the hatchet, but that was, the feds had him dead to rights by the time he had offered me the label, and I'm glad I didn't take it.
Exactly.
To answer your question, we right at the very end, Morris sent for me. I couldn't come because I was in Chicago doing a show. I was to go up to his farm the next day where he was dying, and he died that night. So I never got a chance to really say what I was feeling. And by the way, the last scene in the movie and the last scene in the book is me having this sort of imaginary conversation with Morris.
Yeah.
And, you know, it was, like I said, the whole thing was very therapeutic for me.
I hope that imaginary conversation includes an imaginary check he's writing you for all of the royalties he ripped off of you.
Zeros at the end.
Yeah. Me, the Mob, and the Music is the new book from Tommy James. You can link up to him through our website. Let's get one more question. Stephanie is in Anchorage on Coast to Coast. Stephanie?
Hi, Ian. Hi, Tom. This is the second time I've talked to you. I met you back in 1975, 76.
Really?
Yeah, I ran into you. You were coming up the stairs, and I was going down, and I thought you were my boyfriend, Tommy Patterson. And I said, Tom, and because he wore the same kind of sweaters that you had on.
Where was this, Stephanie?
Duluth, Minnesota.
Really?
I was going to school at University of Wisconsin at Superior.
And darn, yeah.
We came over, and then I said, "Oh, I'm so sorry," and I kept going down the stairs, and I knew, and I went, "Oh my God, that was Tommy James."
Oh, that's so funny.
You're a dork.
Small world.
Yeah. So that's funny.
But I'm wondering, did this still go on at that time?
Yeah, how much? That's a great question, Stephanie. And I meant to ask. This is what I think would be very interesting to explore at length later on. So we just have a minute. So give us how much mob work was going on at the other labels in the 60s and 70s.
Well, certainly nothing like Roulette. Roulette was ground zero for all this stuff. But I mean, there was influence everywhere. RCA, Atlantic. I mean, there very definitely were MCA out on the coast. But it wasn't like Roulette, where it was just flat out owned by these people.
Right.
And
and Clive Davis, Mike Curb, David Geffen, nobody
were quite straight. I mean,
they never killed a guy. They never beat people up. Yeah, which is just part of the very unusual story, and then the personal story too is told about your growing addiction, your awareness of your addictions and how you overcame those, and that's all in the book too. Me, the Mob, and the Music.
And we talk about the music too. We talk about the hits.
Well, you got the hits just also speak for themselves too. But it's neat to hear the backstory to things like Crystal Blue Persuasion, Crimson and Clover, and even this record that started it all for you, the Hanky Panky, and how you were a junior in high school when suddenly you were becoming an international star, and most importantly, you survived, which is to your credit. You survived.
Listen, I want to tell you something, Ian. Truly, I thank the fans and the good Lord for the kind of longevity we've had. This is a business that maybe gives you 2-3 years. We've been doing it for 44, and so I am quite sincere about that.
Well, and that's interesting. Look at that. Your son's 45, and you've been doing it for 44.
Yes.
You are truly one of the grandfathers of pop music today, and you should wear that proudly, because there's a lot of people.
That's a fact.
A lot of people making pop records that still sound like Tommy James records to me. So thank you so much for your time, and look forward to chatting with you again someday.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Me, the Mob, and the Music. You can link up to Tommy James through our website, coasttocoastam.com. Before the pyramids, what existed before the pyramids, other than the mafia? We'll get to that next on Coast to Coast. This is Ian Punnett.